Hello and welcome to Inspired to Taste. I'm Liz Joy, and today I'll be making these fashionable and witchy cookies that feature duo-toned cookie dough effects, lots of stylish details, and delicious fillings. I'm going to start with this hat design, which includes a lace cookie base, a 3D fondant bow, painted effects, and blackberry buttercream filling. First things first is the duo-toned lace cookie. To start, you'll need sugar cookie dough dyed in a color of your choice and a lace-textured silicone mat. For the dyed cookie dough, I highly recommend adding food coloring to your wet ingredients while mixing the dough. This will give you the best color vibrancy while helping avoid over-mixing the dough, which can create a tough texture. Working with a little bit of dough at a time, I'm spreading it onto the mat with my hand first, then using a scraper to firmly press it into the mold, continuing until it's evenly filled. Then I'm just going to set it aside for a minute. Next, I'm going to grab cookie dough dyed in a contrasting color and roll it out to my desired thickness. Since these are sandwich cookies, I recommend no thicker than about 1/6 inch. I'm going to set the rolled dough over the lace mat. I'm using a fondant smoother and a lot of pressure to secure the purple dough onto the mat. You can also roll it firmly with a rolling pin. Then I'm going to chill this in the freezer for about 10 to 15 minutes. Now that it's nice and chilled firm, I can work on removing the dough. Just carefully peel back the mat. How pretty is that? And then I can cut out my hats, making sure I'm happy with the lace placement on each. You can download the printable templates for these shapes as well as STL files to 3D print your own cutters in the description below. Then just bake as per your recipe's instructions. Mine are going in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 12 to 14 minutes or until the edges are nice and firm. I'm going to be making this bow in 5 separate pieces and then just attaching it to look like one piece on the cookie with royal icing. So I'm going to do 2 loops and the end streamers and then the knot. I just want to make sure everything fits together. I'll let them dry separately and then I'll attach them to the cookie. First, we want to dust our cutting surface with a little bit of cornstarch and your fondant as well, just to make sure it doesn't stick. And I just want to roll it to a nice, even, smooth surface. To cut ribbon, I generally like to use a straight edge instead of a knife. I have these kind of flexible clay cutting blades that are really sharp. And for longer pieces, I like to get these very cheap flexible rulers. You can find these at like the dollar store. They have a nice sharp edge because they're so thin and it can help you get a nice clean cut. I'm just using the lines on my cutting board as a guide, keeping everything to about the same width, and I'm going to start with the loops. So for these, you can start by just cutting roughly even strips. And then what I do to get a gathered effect is I start by folding each into an M. So I fold it in half, and then I bring the ends down. You can see how it's a little M, and that gives you a really nice realistic gathered effect. And I'm going to do that on both ends. So fold in half into a V, and then bring those edges down into an M shape. And there we have a nice little gathered effect. And my fondant is really soft, so I'm just going to press it together. I don't even need any water. And I'm going to do that to both pieces. Do a V, and then bring my ends down, flip it over, fold into a V, and bring the ends down again. And so we end up with this gathered effect. And then I'm going to loop and press. And I want these just big enough to cover the center of the hat, so I will be cutting them down. Alright, so we can go back here and get rid of some of this squished part. That looks like it'll do it. And now you'll see that these are starting to flatten out. The easiest way to get a really nice open loop is just with a scrap of paper towel. So I cut down little rectangles of paper towel, roll them, and then just carefully insert into the loop. And then just kind of make sure you're happy with that shape. And then I'll just repeat on this side. I'm going to roll, insert, and let that open up a bit. And then just make sure that the volume is kind of towards the outside. And there we have our loop sections. Now the rest is pretty easy. I'm just going to cut the ribbon streamers at similar widths. And I'm going to take them a little bit narrower at one end. And I'll cut them down further with scissors, but we'll start here. So for these, I'm going to do the same thing because I want a gathered effect. So I'm doing that little M-shaped gather on the narrow end. I don't want all of this. I'm just going to cut that down and kind of gauge where I want the length of this to fall. And then I'm going to cut it at an angle. And I'm going to work on giving these just a slight sense of movement so they feel a little bit organic. For the knot, I'm just going to cut a tiny rectangle and then I kind of give it a pinch in the center, fold it over, and fit it in right here. You can use a dry paintbrush or fondant sculpting tool or clay tool and just kind of press that into place. Again, I'm not attaching anything right now. I'm just going to let all the pieces dry separately. And then I'll attach them once they're dry because I'm going to be doing some additional work on the bottom portion of the hat. So I'm just going to make all of my bows for all of my cookies, set those aside to dry, and then I'll attach them once I'm through with all the under stuff. I'm using an edible marker to sketch my hat brim. Then going in and painting this area that would be the inside lining with a dark purple food coloring. Bringing back this purple edible marker, I'm adding an outline to all the edges. I think outlines are such an easy way to make a design feel more substantial and finished. Then I'm going to draw some gathers and wrinkles. To make the brim portion stand out and look more 3D, I'm using royal icing to attach a thin strip of fondant. Then using a clay tool to press in a stitched effect. You can also use a scribe tool or toothpick to do this. I'll be using my royal icing to attach the bow pieces, starting with this loop. Then the knot, the other loop, and the ribbon ends. I felt like it needed a more delicate edge to tie into the lace patterns, so I'm adding dots of royal icing to all the edges for a lacy border effect. And for the final step, I'm going to be adding a delicious blackberry Italian meringue buttercream filling. I've linked to the base recipe I used for my buttercream. After mixing it, just add blackberry jam to taste. It's that easy. You can also add a couple drops of food coloring to pump up the color a bit. And now that these wickedly pretty hats are finished, let's move on to the boots. My boot cookies will feature a snakeskin lace cookie base, fondant straps, royal icing buckles and chains, and a chocolate ganache filling. I'm using this texture that's kind of like a snakeskin texture, but you can use any lace mat for this that suits your needs. Our first step is going to be scraping this dough into the lace mat. So I'm starting with a black dough and then I'm going to lay green dough over the top. And I'm just going to do this in small sections to make it manageable. So I'm going to use the flat of my hand and just start working it in. And then once that's pretty thinned out, I can go back with my cake scraper. And this takes a bit of patience. If you've ever worked with cake lace, you kind of know the drill. You want to make sure that you're scraping from different directions. And once I'm happy with that, I'll just set my lace mat aside for a few minutes. Next, I'm going to roll out some lime green cookie dough. And then I thought I'd add some darker green spots for color variation. So I'm just going to randomly drop bits of this dough on top until I'm happy with the general pattern. Roll it once more. Then I'm placing the dough pattern side down onto the lace mat and using a rolling pin to firmly roll it into the mat. Then I'll chill this in the freezer for about 10 to 15 minutes. Here's my chilled dough. I'm just going to flip it over and then carefully peel back the mat. Now I can cut out all my boots. I'll re-roll all the dough scraps to use for the bottoms of my sandwich cookies. Once the cookies have been baked and cooled, I can begin decorating, starting with some fondant straps. I'm using my clay blade to cut out strips of fondant. And I'll be using royal icing to attach them to the cookies. Once the first two straps are on, I'm using my favorite clay tool to add a stitched effect along the edges, and a scribe tool to create notches. Then I'm adding a third strap, and finally, thin strips for the outsole and the base of the heel, and one more strip at the heel seam. I'm building up my royal icing buckles by piping several layers until the outer edges are even with the fondant strap, then finishing the square and adding the prong. To create chains, I start by piping a row of ovals close to each other but not touching, then going back and connecting them with lines. As soon as the royal icing's dried, I can paint it with edible silver from Bakel mixed with color solution from the sugar art. For the boot filling, I decided to go with a rich dark chocolate ganache. You can find the recipe in the description below. And here's the finished collection. Probably more stylish than spooky, but undeniably enchanting and delicious.